Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time to join with us today. We really do appreciate it. If I could just have the first slide there, please, Jenny. So my name is Fiona Templeton, and I am an adoptive parent. And my research project is entitled My Experience of School, the Perspective of Adopted Young People aged 16 to 21 years. And the piece of research that I did was completed as part of a master's in development and co-production of social care research at Ulster University. And as a service user carer, my place on the course was funded by the Health and Social Care Board, for which I'm very...
Sorry, Fiona, the volume's not great coming through here. If you could try and keep to the mic a wee bit more, that would be helpful.
Okay. Well, what do we see? Is that any better?
Yes, that's perfect.
Better, okay. So I'm very appreciative of the funding, which enabled me to do the research, and it was based here in Northern Ireland. The research has been published in Pastoral Care and Education now, so it is available online to read the actual article based on this piece of research. And before we start to look at the research findings, I just want to make you aware that not just my talk, but all three talks today contain some emotionally heavy material, and I just want to give you the heads up for that, and I just want you to take care of yourself as you listen, and if you need to take a break, that is fine, and maybe whenever the talks are finished, you take a bit of fresh air or do something very nice to relieve whatever you've had to listen to through our talks, and hopefully they'll be informative and useful. So next slide, please.
Fiona, your sound is gone completely.
Okay.
Welcome to the world. So yes, we can hear you now. It's just
okay.
It's important.
So this quotation reminds me of one young woman that I had interviewed, and I asked her, if I said to you school, what feeling does it conjure up? And she answered, it depends on what school. If you're talking about my first secondary school, it would be angry. I would punch every person in that place if I could. I just hate everyone in that school. And if you want to say my second secondary school, I would say happy. I'd actually say grateful. In her first school, the opportunity to see that she was so much more than what they saw was missed. Next slide, please. So why did I do this research? As an adoptive parent and a skills trainer with Adoption UK, I've become increasingly aware that school can be a very challenging place for adopted young people, and it can have a detrimental impact on them and their families. Recent Adoption UK surveys have shown that education is consistently a top priority for adoptive families, that adopted young people are 20 times more likely to be permanently excluded from school than their peers, and 60% of adoptive parents do not think that their child has an equal chance at school due to their life experiences. Indeed, in our schools, adopted young people can be an invisible population. In 2018, I completed a systematic review of existing research, which found that the early life experiences of adopted young people can result in future challenges around love, trust, fear, and identity. These challenges can then play out in the school environment and require informed and therapeutic responses from the adults working with these young people. The review also revealed a lack of information on the current situation in Northern Ireland and a need to hear from the adoptees themselves. A draft document entitled Strategy for Looked After Children, Improving Children's Lives was released for consultation in May 2018, with publication of the final document imminent. The document is of note for two main reasons. It was co-produced by the Departments of Health and Education, and it broadens the term looked after to include young people who are care experienced, extending to those who have been adopted. It states, by bringing forward this joint health and education strategy, we are acknowledging that a more targeted approach is required, which takes account of the specific needs of looked after children, their unique in-care experiences, and their post-care challenges. It is an acknowledgement that an extra push is required to address earlier, often very difficult pre-care lives. It's hoped that the findings of this research project will help with the directing of this extra push as the needs of adopted young people become included in new initiatives. Slide, please. The methods. This small-scale qualitative research project.
Could someone please go on mute? Thank you.
The
Apologies for that.
small-scale qualitative research project comprised of 9 individual face-to-face interviews conducted by myself. 8 interviews were carried out in the home of the participants with an adult present in the house, and 1 interview was carried out in the Adoption UK office. All necessary ethical permissions and consents have been granted, and a distress protocol was in place. Visual prompts were made available during the interviews and were used by participants to varying degrees. Next slide, please. The sample included 9 young people aged between 16 and 21 years who had been adopted from care in the United Kingdom and had attended the mainstream school in Northern Ireland for at least 1 year. Their age of placement for adoption ranged from 4 months to 5.5 years. At the time of the interview, 3 were still at school, 3 were at university, and 3 were either in further education or employment. They reported on their experience in primary, secondary, and grammar school, with 1 young person having moved from mainstream education to education other than at school at the age of 14. Although small in number, the sample was rich in variety of experience. Next slide, please. The findings, go back one, please. The findings of the research can be reported under 3 main headings: the impact of being an adopted young person, the adopted young person in school, and the teacher's approach. Next slide, please. So the impact of being an adopted young person could be seen in 3 main areas: loss, trauma, and personal understanding of adoption. Loss. Participants reported losses in several areas: loss of relationships with birth family, including siblings. 1 participant commented, "It's a bit like you're the alien of the family. It's like you're adopted and everyone else isn't." Loss of trust, resulting in challenges around establishing and maintaining relationships. Whenever you're in care or you're adopted, 1 young person stated, it's like you don't really trust anybody. Can I just check, can you hear me okay?
Yes, it's a bit come and go. I've asked people to turn their cameras off to see if that improves. You don't have the earphones there at all, Fiona? No.
I can get them. It'll just take me 1 moment, but it might be worth doing. Is that okay?
Yeah, it might be.
I'll do that quickly. Sorry.
No problem. This is what happens in the digital world. we spent quite a bit of time going through this yesterday or Monday, and yeah, on the day there's always difficulty, so bear with us, everyone. We'll try and get this addressed quickly. Again, any questions, I'm noting them down here through the chat, and we can present them back to our presenters this morning.
While we're just waiting, can everybody who's not on mute, can you mute yourselves, please?
I'm nearly ready. Sorry, apologies for this.
Oh, that's an awful lot better, Fiona.
we've 189 people on this morning, so sometimes that has an impact.
And there also seems to be technical glitches throughout various networks as well. So it's nice. So
Okay.
How's that?
Perfect.
1000% better.
Okay, apologies for that. Okay. So we're looking at the impact of being an adoptee, and we're talking about the loss. And we're talking about loss of trust. Then loss of information, both personal and in relation to family medical history. A 21-year-old participant revealed, still to this day, I wonder if my mum had more kids after me, which I don't know about. Loss of control over their own lives, as others have made decisions regarding their future without consulting them. One young person comments, you could have principals, doctors, teachers, parents, social workers talk about you. They're making decisions for you, and you don't have a choice at all. So I'll just take a wee glass of water. It's not good to run up the stairs and then try to talk afterwards. Trauma. Participants alluded to traumatic experiences prior to adoption, which have had a long-term impact on their lives. One young person states there was abuse and neglect, and there's a whole list of things. The personal understanding of adoption. Participants' personal understanding of adoption developed over the years, with the entry into secondary school identified as a pivotal point. During this time, they may have lied about being adopted to avoid feeling odd. I never cared about being adopted as much as when you get into secondary school, one young person stated. Because when you get into secondary school, you're more open to parents being split or single mums. And you're like, why didn't she, meaning their birth mum, be a single mum? And all those other questions open up. Knowing other adopted young people was seen to be beneficial as it made adoption seem more normal. The adoptee in school. Whilst participants did talk in more generic terms about challenges with school and the work being boring and so on, it was important to establish if and how their experience of school had been impacted by being an adoptee. The research identified 4 main areas where this was indeed the case: relationships, behaviour, lesson content, and environment. Next slide, please. For all the young people interviewed, the quality of their relationships in school was a key indicator of their overall school experience. Whilst 2 participants reported no difficulties, challenges around friendships and relationships in school was a common theme for the remaining 7 participants. 3 participants very clearly saw these challenges as a direct result of the loss and trauma they had suffered in early childhood. Managing lots of relationships, maintaining friendships, and repairing fractured relationships were identified as being particularly difficult. Next slide, please. Behaviour. Behaviour was an important theme in the interviews, with 4 participants reporting negative behaviours, which resulted in them moving school in or at the end of Key Stage 3, years 8 to 10. Behaviours reported included fighting, arguing with teachers, being the class clown, and damaging property. One participant describes their behaviour in year 10. They said, for about half the year, my behaviour was quite horrific, as in physical altercations every couple of days. Another remembers My mom was in and out of school every day for me being bad and getting detentions, and I had suspensions and everything, but there was problems there. Two participants who reported the most extreme behaviours saw a clear link between their early life experiences and what was happening in school, with one participant referring to their behaviour as the signs of trauma. When talking about their behaviour, these participants viewed it as something that required understanding rather than punishment. They did not expect the behaviours to be excused, but they did expect support and guidance as to how to manage their behaviour in a more acceptable way. One participant states, teachers never asked why. They never wanted to know the reason. I was so upset. They always assumed I was being a brat. So that led me to go mad and constantly argue even more. Next slide, please. Lesson content. Whilst most participants reported adoption being explicitly mentioned in subjects such as RE and child development, this was not seen as presenting a difficulty. The challenging material came in a more subtle form. 5 participants identified lessons on life story or the study of genetics as particularly sensitive, with questions being asked that they simply did not have the answers to. One participant recalled a homework about her life story at secondary school. She says, there was a big argument with my mum about the homework because it turned into her having to tell me everything about adoption and her having to say, actually, I don't know quite what you read when you were born. Regarding material being covered in class, there was a general consensus that amongst teachers, there is no awareness of the sensitivities of an adoptee. Next slide, please. The environment. Managing the school environment posed challenges for several participants. Crowded school corridors, being constantly surrounded by people, the feeling of being locked up and feeling more comfortable in a particular chair were all reported. One participant recalled, I felt like actually taking in a golf club and pretending I was blind most of the time just to keep people away from me. Some participants developed their own way of coping, for example, bringing in books to read to avoid interactions with others, holding back when the bell went to avoid packed corridors, or going to a room at lunchtime rather than the playground. One participant went to play the piano rather than go to class. What was very clear was that the extent to which the impact of being an adoptee affected their experience of school depended on how the adults around them responded to them. Next slide, please. The teacher's approach. Of the 9 participants interviewed, 5 had moved school due to issues around behaviour or a perceived lack of understanding of their social, emotional, and behavioural needs. 4 found the move to have a positive impact on their experience of school. The main reason for this was the approach of the teachers and the culture of the new school. Participants who had previously reported extreme behaviours, multiple detentions, suspensions, and a cycle of negativity subsequently recorded settled behaviour, academic success, and positive relationships with teachers and peers, all which greatly impacted their self-esteem. A controlling and punitive approach in school was seen to be ineffective and degrading. What worked for these young people was having teachers who were informed, empathetic, and supportive. They benefited from having adults around them who understood the challenges they faced and who worked with them to provide strategies to overcome the issues. This approach needed to be ingrained in the culture of the school, with good communication essential.
The opportunity to repair fractured relationships between peers and teachers was a key ingredient to helping participants to move forward. Next slide, please. So now looking at the findings of the research in terms of the knowledge that's already out there on the impacts of trauma. Whilst relatively small scale, this qualitative study is rich in variety and experience and gives a necessary insight into the perception of adoptees on their experience of school. The findings correlate with the recognition of the Department of Education that care experienced children tend to struggle with the demands of school, and they do much better in some schools than others. The experience of loss can make navigating future relationships challenging for adoptees, as well as having a huge impact on their sense of identity. This echoes the findings recorded in the narrative review. Whilst adolescence can be a perplexing time for any young person, Keck highlights that for an adoptee who may have experienced trauma, grief, and loss, the creation of a new identity will be even more complex. Adoptees benefit from knowing that it is okay to talk and be curious about their birth family. Post-adoption social workers have a responsibility to support adoptive families with contact and life story work, particularly during adolescence. The long-lasting impact of developmental trauma is now well documented. Balmer summarizes, trauma and loss adversely affect the brain. The damage profoundly affects a child's emotional and social development, which can seriously impede their ability to learn and make sense of the intentions and interactions of others. The challenging behaviour reported by several participants also correlates with the findings of the review. Forbes states that as a result of developmental trauma, the nervous system is hardwired at an elevated state. And these challenging behaviours are demonstrative of the internal, chaotic world churning inside. This rings true with the belief of the participants that whilst their negative behaviour should not be excused, it should be understood rather than punished. For some participants, the magnitude of trying to cope with the school environment itself left little in reserve to manage the multiple relationships, not to mention the workload. The Department of Education recognises that traumatised children have a sensitised alarm response, which overreacts to all kinds of verbal, non-verbal, and sensory triggers. This means that seemingly minor threats can cause dramatic changes in behaviour. Balmer explains that trauma-affected children can collapse emotionally when they feel overwhelmed or stressed. It does not take much for them to quickly unravel. Even minor stressors can trigger this response. For example, someone brushing past him, someone looking at him. How the adults respond to such incidents can cause them to escalate or de-escalate. The Department of Education cautions, avoid discipline that involves separation, rejection, anger, or fear. Unfortunately, it will be the young person who bears the consequence if the situation is not handled appropriately. Records show that in the school year of 2018 to 19, 4,549 pupils were suspended from mainstream schools in Northern Ireland. The main reason for suspension, counting for 2,321, was persistent infringement of school rules. Next slide, please. And the next one, please. A policy of exclusion or isolation can encourage a child to go off into its own world and dissociate, exacerbating the type of emotional disconnection found in attachment disorders. Balmer reminds us that, in contrast, an empathetic relationship is powerful as it facilitates brain growth and emotional development. Whilst there's no easy way to know how many of these suspended pupils were adopted, it must be questioned as to whether this approach is beneficial to any young person for persistent infringement of school rules. With all that is known, why do some adopted young people still have to function in controlling and punitive school environments? Why do they have to struggle on a daily basis because adults around them are uninformed, lacking in empathy, not offering appropriate support? In the words of the strategy for Looked After Children, our challenge is to provide tailored support to ensure that they have a positive and engaging learning experience through which they will reach their full potential alongside the rest of the school population. Next slide, please. So just some recommendations. In light of the findings of this research project, the following are some recommendations. For education, training on the impact of developmental trauma and how it can impact on a child in the school environment for all student and established teachers. Review of school discipline policies in the light of the findings. The Education, Training and Inspectorate to include a report of how attachment aware a school is following their inspections. Having an identified advocate for adopted young people within each school. Next slide, please. For health and social care, training of social workers in the delivery of life story material, ongoing training. Training for prospective adopters on the impact of early life trauma and loss, a therapeutic approach to managing behaviour and the importance of life story work. Ongoing support to adoptive families, particularly on the approach of adolescence. Next slide, please. So what about you in your working environment or in the people that you're dealing with? I would encourage you to be curious, to realize that what you're seeing is not all there is to that person. Recognize that it can be hard to trust you, and you might feel you're very trustworthy, and you may well be, but the young person or person you're dealing with may have a history of being let down and betrayed and trust broken. Work to create an emotionally safe environment. Record information carefully. The details of these young people's lives are important. Learn more about the impact of trauma. And remember, there is more to the person than you're currently seeing. And just to finish, this research is not setting out to stereotype. Every adopted young person is an individual and their journey is individual, but there are lessons that we can learn. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Fiona. There's been some interesting information come through in the chat, so keep an eye on that and feel free to respond. Just quickly, Fiona, before we go on, thank you very much for that presentation. I know you had some difficulties, but we've ironed them out well. There was a few questions come through. Andrew Taylor has a question. Andrew, if you want to pose your question to Fiona. Was Andrew there? Okay, Andrew's question, Fiona, was how did the levels of contact through the journey towards adoption and how they found the change in children's post-adoption when contact was reduced? And I know you touched a bit about that, the pressure points. Have you anything you would like to add on that?
So that's a question about contact with birth relatives, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, how did the presenters feel at the levels of contact through the journey towards adoption and how they found the change in children post-adoption when contact was reduced? So is there a need for more support there, do you think? Or?
Well, I did not ask them anything specific about their contact arrangements. So I couldn't answer that specifically. But what I can say is that the importance of the birth family came across from all of the young people. And it wasn't necessarily that they wanted to see them or meet up with them. Each individual felt differently about that. But what was important was that they were not forgotten and they were acknowledged.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Fiona. Nahid also had a question around, is it adopted or foster care children that are feeling less accepted? I don't know if you have a view on that.
Again, I wasn't speaking to any young people who were fostered. I was just speaking to these young people who had been adopted. And maybe that's referring to that entry into secondary school where some of them would have maybe lied about being adopted. I think most young people want to fit in, and anything that makes them feel as if they're different can be a huge challenge. And I suppose it's up to the adults around the young person to help them meet others who are like them, and also to help them process ways in which they maybe are different, and to see how really we're all different in different ways.
Thank you, Fiona. And I think we have one final question from Teresa Nixon around recommendations for ETI. Are you there, Teresa?
Hello.
Hello, Teresa.
Can you hear?
Hello.
Hello, Fiona. Thank you. Fiona,
Hello.
just a recommendation. You were just, that slide was pretty quick. The ETI, the Educational Training Inspector recommendation about they should include something around the attachment. Can you just flick back to that and explain that in terms of how they would know the children in school who would have attachment disorders?
Are you able to control the slides there, Jenny?
The one on education, just.
So recommend, yeah, that one there.
Education,
So so there can be, I mean, I don't have any in front of me here, but there can be things for an inspector to look for in terms of an attachment aware school and environment. And it's not necessarily that the inspectorate is aware of children within the school who have challenges around attachment. And those children, that's not just adopted young people who may have those challenges. They can be found in many different young people for many different reasons. But I think for the reason I have that there is that for adoptive parents, it is very difficult to know whether a school is informed in issues around attachment and trauma or not. And even going to open nights and talking to people, it can appear that there is a bit of knowledge there, but actually the culture of the school is not conducive to helping young people who have challenges around attachment. But there are other organizations, for example, trauma-informed schools, who can help a school put things into place which can be seen or could be recognized by an inspectorate to help it be. It's not something that's easily measured, but I think it can be to an extent.
I suppose the key indicator is whether the school has included trauma-informed practice in their training of teachers, so that they will understand.
But that might be part of it. A one-off training would not be sufficient, and if it became a tick box exercise of just that, then it would be pointless. It's more the culture of the school. What happens? What does the behavior policy look like? Is it solely punitive? What is in place to help young people when they are feeling emotionally overwhelmed? Is there a place for them to go? Is there an understood procedure to allow them to have space in order to regulate themselves? These things can be in place and can be seen. It's not simply a one-off training. It needs to be embedded in the culture of a school.
Understand that. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. I know there's continues to be good discussion on chat, so keep that going, people. I think at this stage we will move to Elizabeth a little. Elizabeth, you're very welcome this afternoon. So whenever you're ready. You're on mute, Elizabeth.
There we are. Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name's Elizabeth Little. Like Fiona, I'm a service user graduate of the Master's Research Methods programme. And for my research project, I focused on adoption disruption or breakdown. I would use those terms interchangeably. I'm an adopter also, and I have some experience of disruption, but I also worked for 12 years for Adoption UK, supporting adoptive families who were facing extreme challenges and sometimes breakdown in their adoptions. Next slide, please. I suppose adoption is one of those topics that can evoke the deepest of emotions. It certainly is the stuff of dreams and expectations and hope. But equally, it has been and still is for some the stuff of secrets and shame. Whatever you think or feel about adoption, it remains a means in this country and in many others of providing permanency for children unable to grow up within their own birth family. The decision to grant an adoption is, of course, life-changing and affects many people in profound ways, some positive, some negative. So I guess those big questions keep on needing to be asked. Does adoption provide a good outcome for children? Does our current adoption practice serve all the players involved well? So what does the research say? Next slide, please. A literature review published in 2019, which is the third title on the screen there, concluded that adoption still provides a legitimate model for the alternative care of children if undertaken within a rights and ethics framework that emphasises children's best interests. It found that adoption introduced a major positive change in adopted people's life trajectory. However, it also found convincing evidence that pre-adoption adversity, for example, abuse and neglect or multiple separations, may have substantial short and long-term negative consequences for children's development. As far as adoption breakdown is concerned, research in England and Wales published in 2015 by Julie Selwyn and her team, that's the first title there, found the rate of adoptions likely to disrupt was small, 3.2%. But they also found that approximately 25% of adoptions encountered serious difficulties. There's been very little qualitative research carried out that gives an in-depth view of adoption disruption. So the aim of my small study was to capture the voice of families in Northern Ireland who had a lived experience of a disrupted adoption. So how did I go about the research and who did I talk to? Next slide, please. In my study, I defined adoption disruption as a breakdown in the family unit, resulting in the adopted child leaving home prematurely and entering the care system in Northern Ireland for 3 months or more. An adoption order had to have been in place for at least a year, and the disruption to have occurred no more than 8 years before the time the research was carried out, which was in 2019. Following the granting of ethical approval, Adoption UK helped with recruitment and 13 families volunteered to participate. Most of the families, as you can see there, were adopted from the care system in Northern Ireland, a few from other UK countries and 2 from abroad. Next slide. I looked at the disruption of 11 individual children and 2 sibling groups. And as you can see there, the most common age at disruption was 14. Next slide. 7 children had lived 13 months or less with their birth family, 7 between 2 and 3 years. 2 boys didn't leave their birth home until they were 5. Neglect or abuse were the reported reasons for the children leaving home, though there was 1 child who was relinquished at birth. Next slide. That child and a sibling group only moved once. Half the children had lived in 1 stable foster placement for a significant period of time. But there were a few children who had multiple moves, including one child who had experienced a failed adoption placement. Next slide. So what age were they when they were placed for adoption? One child was placed at birth, 4 around their 2nd birthday, 4 around their 3rd, and 7 children were between 5 and 8 when they moved to their adoptive home. Next slide. I interviewed 7 couples and 6 sole parents, and my aim was to gather parents' views on these 5 core areas: the challenges faced in relation to the child who left home, the impact of dealing with these challenges in family life, the reasons for the disruption as perceived by the parents, the input of social services before, during, and after the disruption, and the issues related to having an adopted child in care. Next slide, please. So the findings, as I report them here, focus on these 5 key factors that parents felt were significant in the breakdown of the adoption, and they cover the main themes emerging from the research. Next slide. So the first one is safety issues, and I'll give you a chance to read the quotes there before I speak to them. The safety of the children, but also of other family members, was in the end the most urgent issue for families. Several parents had children who they felt were difficult to keep safe, some at risk of sexual exploitation, some with very disturbing behaviours from early in the placement. A few children had suicidal thoughts and more self-harmed. No, same slide, sorry. Aggression and violence by children were present in most homes. Physical attacks were mentioned in 10 interviews. There was verbal abuse, intimidation, allegations, threats to hurt or kill, and the destruction of property by children. Angry outbursts often happened after school, feelings that had been contained, erupting in some cases only at home. Controlling behaviours were frequently described, with children making it impossible for the family to function normally. Siblings were often targeted. One adoption finally disrupted when a child who'd been bullied by a sibling threatened suicide. Most children were reported to be strong-willed from an early age, getting progressively more self-determined and oppositional as they got older, defying not just parents but other authority figures. With a few exceptions, parents were well versed in attachment and trauma theory and practiced therapeutic parenting as best they could. Some had ongoing professional support for many years. Nevertheless, they found themselves at a loss to know how to keep their children safe in the world, and at times keep themselves and others safe from their children. Support networks disappeared as challenges became more intense. Parents tended to hide the reality of home life from family and friends because of guilt and shame, fear that family would be dismissive or disapproving, that the child would get a bad reputation, that it was beyond family to help anyway. They often felt a need to protect family from worry and hurt and harm. And in the end, neighbours tended to keep their children away and community supports dried up. Seven children initiated unplanned contact with birth family. Many parents became aware that the birth family was a significant presence in their child's thinking and imagination. Some children were given a version of their history by birth family that contradicted the story they had been told about why they were adopted. Parents found talking to their children about their history difficult, and social workers often became involved delivering life story work. The parents in this study rarely found this helpful. One mother was critical of an inexperienced social worker, believing that the way life story work had been handled had been a factor in the disruption. Next slide. Both adoption and other children's services came in for a lot of criticism. Without exception, parents
It
felt
just won't let me in.
Without exception, parents felt they could have been prepared better for the possibility of extreme behaviours and disruption. They repeatedly talked of the lack of information at placement. Often parents felt that social workers didn't grasp the level of difficulty they were facing. The feeling of not being listened to or believed was common. They felt social workers were out of their depth and offered stock interventions, whether appropriate or not. Their non-engagement with services was, they felt, frowned upon. Most parents had requested direct help and support for the child, not just themselves. In some cases, this was available and welcomed, but then staff would leave, and it was difficult, as you can imagine, for the child to start again with someone new. The lack of continuity was often criticised. At least 8 families were investigated by a child protection team and often the police. Parents spoke of this process as traumatising, destructive and undermining of their parental role. One of the strongest themes in the study was parents' feelings of being judged and blamed by social workers and other professionals, but particularly those outside the adoption field who were more used to working with birth families. Parents reported a lack of adoption knowledge and experience, insight and empathy. Once the child was in care, it often seemed to parents that social workers' focus was solely on the child and their views were disregarded. Parents felt this approach undermined their relationship with the child, which they wanted and expected to continue. While there was often praise for individual social workers, the experience of most parents was that the intervention of social services created additional stress in a situation that was already overwhelming. Next slide. So, not surprisingly, stress and strain was a major factor in the disruption. Parents had very little respite and were worn down, a number on medication to treat stress and depression. They spoke of feeling battered and exhausted by the relentless nature of the challenges they faced. Some described a shutting down of feeling. It was difficult to function normally as a family or keep down a job. When parents were weary with trying to cope, one frightening incident was often the tipping point that took the child into care. It's like two worlds colliding, one parent concluded. He was describing the impact of his adopted children on the life of his family. Most parents were of the opinion that a third world came crashing in to add to the catastrophe, that of social services. A common theme in all 3 worlds emerged. The presence of fear appeared to destroy the possibility of trust and create the need to be in control. It's widely accepted that trauma-experienced children develop fear-based adaptive behaviours to survive the hostile worlds they live in. resistance to trust, and a need to be in control are two such behaviours often found in children who go on to be adopted. Parents in this study reported experiencing extreme forms of these behaviours in their homes. Fears for the safety and well-being of their children was the focus of these parents, often from early in the placement. Many also came to fear the children themselves. Caught up in their children's trauma, parents appeared to be traumatised themselves. Disappointed, often angry at the approach and interventions of the service providers called in to support, many parents quickly became wary of social services, afraid of social workers misinterpreting situations, afraid of losing their children, or of losing their role and influence in their children's lives. Trust in these circumstances became impossible. Generally, parents perceive themselves in a poorly resourced and often incompetent system whose purpose seemed to them to be to scrutinise for shortcomings, if not for fault. A system operating, it seemed, within policies and procedures so risk-averse that there was rarely a place for adoptive parents and social workers to work together as equal partners for the good of the child in need or in care. Neuroscience, attachment and trauma theory give us the hope that if traumatized children over time can experience an enduring sense of safety in close relationships, their fears may subside, trust develop, and the need to be in control reduce. Our helping services, both statutory and voluntary, claim, of course, to operate on this same foundational principle that safe, trusting relationships are key to offering and receiving help towards healing and positive change. Putting this principle into practice is a complex and difficult business. It requires an alertness to the presence of trauma in those we seek to help, but also a mindfulness of our own individual deep-seated fears that can affect our practice. And not only these, we must surely pay attention to the systemic factors in our organisations that hinder rather than promote effective support. So let me give you just two recommendations based on what the parents in this study said. They wanted honesty and openness at all stages of the adoption process. At preparation, an honest account of the lifelong implications of taking on a traumatized child, full information about the child at matching, an open and honest discussion about what support is likely to be available for the family and for the child, and evidence, if any, of its effectiveness. They asked for competent and trauma-informed workers who treat families with kindness and dignity, listening to and believing them without judgment, who will make careful and knowledgeable assessments in consultation with parents, who will work in partnership with parents in the planning and execution of support, who will stay with the family throughout their adoption journey, if possible, as a support and an advocate. Next slide. I leave you with this slide, a definition of trauma-informed services from the review commissioned by the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland. It was published in 2018. I'm sure many of you may be familiar with it already. I guess the challenge is to take the vision and translate it into practice, not just in adoption, but in all our helping and protecting services. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you for that very powerful presentation, and it has attracted a lot of discussion on the chat. There's no specific questions coming through. I'm happy to take some of those. There are very clear, sobering messages here around not only social work workforce, but the systemic approach that we manage around the trauma-informed practice, awareness, getting the right culture within the school system, and the partnership that's really needed to support parents. So thank you for that. Has anybody any questions we want to ask Elizabeth at this point, or happy to wait until the end of the next presentation? No? Okay. We'll move on to oh, sorry, Elaine has maybe come back. Bear with me here. Yeah, just agreement with Avery's point, which was a really useful point there. The whole system for care, experienced children, stroke adults, is suffering from short-term mindsets, which, just trying to read this here, which works against continuity, relationship-based practice, and step up, step down models of support and service provision. I think that's a very important point. At this stage, we will move on to our next presenter this morning or this afternoon. A warm welcome to Laura Butler, who's a social worker in the family placement team in Northern Health Social Care Trust. You're very welcome, Laura. I'll hand over to you now.
Good afternoon, everybody. I've been listening to Elizabeth and Fiona and thinking what hard acts they are to follow. But so I'm Laura Butler, and I'm a social worker based in Carrickfergus Family Placement Team in the Northern Trust, and I work with foster carers and adoptive parents. And for the last few years, I've been undertaking research related to my field of work, and that is through the Research Methods course at Ulster University, which all three of us can highly recommend. Next slide, please. So just looking at the context and the background to my research, really the recruitment and the retention of foster carers is something that's becoming increasingly challenging for all fostering agencies. Foster carers are a very valuable resource, and fostering remains the key placement of choice when a child needs to leave their birth family and come into the care system. But many foster carers retire or they leave the service for other reasons every year. And whilst the number of children in care actually is rising continually. So the reasons many people leave is because the role is very stressful. And thus there is a need to find ways to retain foster carers, especially when they become very experienced. And support from the agency is important, but also foster carers' own supportive people around them are very important too. Next slide, please. So the study focus, back in 2018, like Elizabeth and Fiona, I carried out a systematic narrative review, which was looking at existing studies, including international studies. And I didn't actually find any that were based in Northern Ireland when I was doing my literature review, which was looking at how personal supports might help develop foster carer resilience. And my conclusion really was that there was good evidence that family and friends did have a role in helping foster carers build resilience. But there were some cultural differences identified in how that support was experienced. And I was really curious as to how that might look within Northern Ireland. So I undertook a qualitative research study within the Northern Trust during 2019. And I interviewed 11 of the most experienced foster carers within our trust. And in the interviews, I explored their thoughts, feelings, and perceptions all about the challenges of fostering, what they described as the challenges of fostering, and how their family and friends, the role that their family and friends had in promoting resilience to help them to continue to foster. Next slide, please. So all the foster carers that I interviewed had experience of short-term or long-term fostering, or a mixture of both. And they had all coped with very challenging behaviour from children who had suffered trauma. And they tended to use a trial and error approach, where they would see whether, changing this or doing that would help the child. But they also used therapeutic approaches, which they had gained through their training. Living with the children who were experiencing trauma could in itself be traumatizing. But all the foster carers that I interviewed expressed a determination not to give up on the children. And there's a quote there from one of the foster carers who says very clearly that it just depends on how you look at your role. I look at it as providing them with as normal as family as what I would have had. And that wasn't about sending them anywhere every time they caused a bit of disruption. Next slide, please. So the findings, all the foster carers were motivated to protect the children's well-being and their confidentiality. They would experience upset themselves if they realized they had missed cues from a child, where the child was upset about something, and if they had missed that they would really feel terrible about that. And all partings with children, even happy ones where the child was going on to their permanent home, or they were returning to birth parents when problems had been sorted out, these would always have an impact. These would be upsetting. But placement breakdowns were extremely traumatic, and they had a direct impact on the foster carers' ability to maintain their resilience. It really did impact very hard. So next slide, please, Jenny. So, some very experienced families became very self-reliant, and they tended to deal with challenging situations by themselves. Some foster carers found that the professional interventions could re-escalate situations that had calmed down, or maybe just weren't effective. And some foster carers thought the professionals actually relied on their self-sufficiency, and that wasn't fair. They felt that, if they rang up and said we're having difficulty, that it could be a couple of days before somebody responded, and they felt, that isn't fair. Professional support wasn't the focus of the study, but as I was talking to the foster carers, they would speak either very positively or alternatively quite critically of professional interventions. At the same time, individual practitioners could have a very beneficial effect, or unfortunately, a very detrimental impact on the foster carer's motivation. So one individual professional could have quite a bit of power. Next slide. So protection of the children's social image and their privacy was very important to these foster carers. And that meant they were unlikely to confide in friends and family about stressful situations and challenging behaviour. They didn't want the children to be labelled. They didn't want them to be seen, perceived in a particular way. They didn't feel that was fair. And support from friends and family was only seen as beneficial and effective if the supportive people understood the fostering role and placed value on it. If they didn't, their support didn't help. And family and friends did not always recognize the additional responsibilities that fostering brought. And they might have expectations of their family member or their friend that couldn't be fulfilled because they were fostering. And unfortunately, some of the supportive people distanced themselves and they didn't want to be involved. And some foster carers actually experienced negative reactions to their family and their friends because they were fostering. Next slide, please. So here's two quotes that kind of illustrate the less supportive responses that people received. The first one, you know, we could never turn to her to support. It was like we went into this on our own and we found that you could never discuss the children with her. And the second one is you know, a foster carer whose husband died and her family and friends just expected her to give up and didn't appreciate how important fostering was to her, that it was a vocation. So there was often an attitude at times that people described to me that when they tried to talk to a family member about how difficult things were, that they would get a response like, well, you got yourself into this, and that would make them feel very let down. So next slide. This is the balancing act. All the foster carers had their own children, and some fostered a number of children at the same time. And protecting everyone in the household from extreme trauma-based behaviour added stress to the fostering role. Sometimes children were at risk from physical injury from the traumatised child's behaviours. The impact on other children could be discreet, though. So at times it could be some sort of intimidation, bullying, possessions taken, or indeed, in some cases, a child in the family could receive very distressing confidences from the child who was fostered. Foster carers experienced the internalized trauma of children to be just as concerning as any physical violence or extreme verbal abuse. One foster carer described how stressful and distressing it was when her foster daughter went into a downward cycle of self-depreciation and acute anxiety. Balancing the needs of very different children who have all been traumatized was challenging. One young person internalized trauma and self-harmed when her foster carer's attention was taken up by younger, very needy children. Foster carers recognized that their own children had made sacrifices in giving up favorite family routines, for example, to accommodate the foster children's needs. Some foster carers' children did not understand their parents' motivation to bring other people's children into their home, but many children of foster carers were actually very involved, embracing the role completely and becoming good advocates for fostering. And some of those children went on to foster themselves. The birth family of foster children could impact on the foster family, often via telephone or social media contact with their child in a way that upset the child. The proximity of birth family to the foster home could be a factor in increasing the potential for interference. But when a contact visit was missed, the child would feel an even greater sense of rejection if the parent had only a short distance to travel, or indeed was observed by the child in the community when they had said they couldn't come to contact because they were unwell. Some foster carers developed a positive relationship with the birth family through empathy and respect for the parent's role in the child's life. In all cases, foster carers were able to help children understand and accept their parents as they were. And the final slide, Jenny, thank you. So really my conclusions and recommendations are that it's very important that we recognize the value of people with insight into fostering. And it's important to promote naturally occurring support for foster families. We need to encourage networking between foster carers right from the beginning when they're recruited. We need to recognize and seek ways to address the unique stresses of fostering. Foster carers found creative support from team assistants very helpful, but on occasions this was abruptly withdrawn, and that could have a detrimental effect. So if a service is going to be taken away, if that could be done gradually so that the foster carer and the team assistant can look at other avenues of support, that would be so much more helpful. And then ensuring that the means to report deteriorating relationships with professionals is accessible and effective is important. Because often the foster carers I spoke to, they maybe were having a difficulty with a particular professional, and they felt they'd no voice. They felt they couldn't say anything. And then explore the promotion of connectedness where existing shared interests may assist matching between a child who needs a foster placement and foster carers. If they share an interest, that can really promote the child's stability in that placement, and promote positive relationships between birth parents and foster carers, but also be mindful of legitimate concerns about contact and how it's affecting a child, and listen to the foster carers when they're explaining what they're concerned about. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Laura. That's excellent presentation. I know we have some questions for you, if you're happy to take them. Avery Bowser, you have a two-link question for Laura, if you want to go ahead and ask her.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Sorry, I'll just actually go back to my own question there. Yeah, it was just two linked things for me. You know, in a way, do we do enough to back foster care's parenting? You know, in the sense that do we parent well enough as a team of foster carers and professionals? And linked to that, so when there are disruptions and breakdowns, do you think sometimes there's a tendency to jump to sort of, well, what was wrong with the foster carers parenting here?
Unfortunately, I think that can happen very easily. I think, you know, it is very easy to assume that something wasn't happening correctly in the foster home, and that may not actually be the case at all. I think we need to be more inquisitive and less adversarial in how we make our assessments sometimes. And I think we do need to promote those working relationships. I mean, some of the working relationships that were described to me when I interviewed the foster carers were excellent. They were really good. People spoke very highly of particular social workers. It's just unfortunate that they also spoke very critically of others. And that's the sad thing. And I think we need to work on what is positive and what works. But yes, definitely, I would agree with what you're saying.
Thank you, Avery. I mean, just some of the chat this afternoon is around the powerful insights emerging from today's research across the three presenters. So thank you for that. Another point, Nuala Smith is saying that the importance of the children's view in relation to placement breaking down is essential going forward in terms of learning. So a really strong response to the presenters today. So thank you for that. We're happy to take, there's more questions coming on here. So bear with me. This is moving too quick for my cursor. Bear with me. Yes.
There's one from Ashley O'Connor.
Yes, thanks, Laura. I think it's so important to promote a better relationship between carers and birth parents. Sorry, it's just skipped past me here. Particularly around understanding and empathy for birth parents while listening to the concerns regarding contact. So often children are caught in the middle of what can be, right, this is going off me. Sorry, yeah, this is better. I've just found how to make it bigger. So the point there is about listening to their concerns regarding contact. So often children are caught in the middle, which impact on the stability of the placement, and establishing links with other carers has been something that seems to work well. So I think that partnership working is really, really important in terms of coming across today. And impacts across both education and within social work, and back to foster parents and adoptive parents. Any other questions before we
There's
proceed?
one from Ashley O'Connor.
Okay, Ashley, do you want to take that question?
Do you want me just to read it out?
Is Ashley there? Yes, go ahead and read it.
Okay. Are there any studies that have been completed on the impact of parents who have had to give up their children for adoption or fostering, and what supports are put in place for them when the process is complete?
I think I'm not sure about whether there are studies in that area or not. There probably are, but I think in terms of supports for parents, I think we do have within the Northern Trust, we do have, there's counselling available that we refer to an outside agency for that, for birth parents when they lose their child to adoption, and we deliberately use an outside agency so that it is someone independent of the trust. But I think there's probably is a place, if there isn't already existing research into the impact, there certainly, it would be a very interesting study for someone to take on, and perhaps somebody else who wants to come and do the research methods program would like to take that on. I think that would be excellent.
Absolutely, Laura. I think the research methods program has been really a great resource, and it's bringing really good information to the fore from us working in the system that voice may not have been heard before. So I think this morning is evidence. We've had 198 people have been online this morning listening to these presentations. So I think that says a lot in terms of the hunger for the information that you've presented. I have, I think, a few more here before we close down. Suzanne Taggart just put on chat, the Pause project has been introduced into Northern Trust, which offers mothers who have had children removed the support. So thank you for that, Suzanne. Really good positive responses on chat about the information presented this morning. So thank you for that. I think at this stage, if there's no further questions, we will close bang on time, I might add.